Everything changed when I lost my dad at 15. Mom wasn't as affected as you'd expect. They hadn't been close in their final years. I was devastated, though, and that loss shaped my next few decisions. At 17, I joined the military, looking for direction and maybe a bit of escape. During my first year away, Mom remarried. My stepfather and I never really clicked. We were just different people. He had this way of making snide comments, always telling me to man up whenever something bothered me. We'd get into arguments, and honestly, I was probably just as much at fault as he was. Nothing too serious, though, just the usual tension you'd expect between a teenager and their new stepfather. After serving for almost 5 years, I got medically discharged. Mom and my stepfather offered to let me stay with them until I got back on my feet. I planned to make it brief and even offered to pay rent, which they declined. But 3 days after moving in, my stepfather pulled me aside when Mom wasn't around and asked what I thought would be fair rent. It was confusing, but I agreed to pay since it was his house. I never mentioned it to Mom, assuming he wanted to keep it between us. My stepfather had a son from his previous marriage who was about a year younger than me. We didn't have much in common, but we got along fine. What bothered me was how differently we were treated. While I was paying rent, my stepbrother got everything handed to him: college tuition, a car, living expenses during school, and even afterward. I didn't want or need their help, but the double standards stung. I moved out after 3 months, and soon after, met someone special. She was my first real relationship, and I was completely smitten. I was nervous about introducing her to my family, especially my mom. I'd always worried Mom would be judgmental about any girl I brought home, but my worries were unfounded. They hit it off immediately. My girlfriend didn't have much family of her own, so she quickly became part of ours. She and Mom would even hang out, just the two of them sometimes, which made me incredibly happy. Even my stepfather seemed to like her, which surprisingly brought us closer together. I learned that his own father had abandoned his family, and he'd put himself through school and built a successful career all on his own. I found myself developing a real respect for him. After about a year, I knew she was the one. When I told Mom and my stepfather about my plans to propose, they seemed overjoyed. Mom even gave me her engagement ring, the one my dad had given her. I worried it might not be fancy enough, but my girlfriend loved it and insisted it wasn't just a placeholder. We started planning the wedding, and for the first time ever, my stepfather and Mom offered to help with the finances. Everything seemed perfect until that phone call from my stepfather. He said I needed to come over immediately. When I arrived, I found my mom, stepfather, stepbrother, and my fiancée all waiting. She was on the couch, clearly having been crying. My first thought was that someone had died, but as I moved to comfort her, my stepfather stopped me. What came next felt like a nightmare. He started accusing me of cheating throughout our entire relationship. I was completely blindsided. Apparently, some woman had contacted my fiancé, claiming we'd been sleeping together for over a year. She had screenshots of supposed conversations and knew personal details about me that a stranger shouldn't know. In my shock and confusion, I couldn't see what was really happening. I begged my fiancé to look at my phone, to see that I'd never done any of this. But as she and my mother sat there weeping, my stepfather called me every name in the book and threw me out, threatening to call the police if I ever came back. I spent weeks trying to contact them. Calls, texts, voicemails, every messaging app I could think of. Nothing worked. Eventually, my stepfather called just to tell me to stop trying to reach her and that I was never welcome around his family again. The only message I got from my mother was a text saying how disappointed she was. My stepfather's entire family shunned me too. The only people who would still talk to me were my dad's brother and his family, though even they seemed unsure about me. Only my uncle truly believed in my innocence, and honestly, I might not have made it through without him. He showed me what real fatherly love looked like, and I've never been more grateful for anyone. I needed to escape, so I packed up and moved to California. Seeing their Christmas photos on Facebook, with my ex-fiancée there smiling among my former family, crushed me. But I was trying to rebuild my life, one day at a time. Almost a year after moving, I got an unexpected call from my stepbrother. I hung up immediately, but something made me keep staring at my phone. When he called again later that night, I finally answered. What he told me turned my world upside down. My ex-fiancée had been devastated for months after our breakup. When she finally started considering dating again, my stepfather encouraged my stepbrother to ask her out. They went on a few dates, but there wasn't any real connection. When my stepbrother told this to my stepfather, he let something slip. "I didn't get rid of her for nothing," he said. "She's a great girl, you need to figure it out with her." I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My stepbrother explained that our father had hired some woman from Tinder to pretend she'd had an affair with me. He'd created fake message screenshots and paid her to contact my fiancée. My stepbrother had been wrestling with this knowledge for a month before finally deciding to tell me. He called to let me know he planned to tell my mom and my ex-fiancée everything the next day. I asked for some time to process it all before they contacted me. A week later, I texted him saying I was ready to talk. My stepbrother's next call revealed even more. He hadn't just confronted our father, he'd been smarter than that. He'd managed to track down the woman from the fake messages and met her in person. She confirmed everything. My stepfather had paid her $1,000 to make that call and destroy my relationship. Even more shocking, she was a Tinder match of his, which suggested he'd been cheating on my mom. The woman agreed to confess everything to my mom and ex-fiancé. My stepbrother arranged for her to meet them while my stepfather was away on business. I can only imagine how that conversation went, with 3 women crying as they realized how they'd been manipulated. I understand a bit better now why they believed the lies so easily. My mom has always struggled with being alone. After my dad died, I became her emotional support, and when I left for the military, my stepfather filled that void. Then my ex-fiancée became part of that too. My ex-fiancée had her own trust issues from not having a family and some bad relationships in her past. She was a few years older than me and sometimes felt insecure about younger girls showing interest in me, even though I never gave them a second glance. None of this excuses what they did, but it helps explain why they were so vulnerable to my stepfather's manipulation. When my stepbrother told me they wanted to call, I realized I still had them blocked from when I'd moved. After unblocking them, my mom called within minutes. Mom's voice cracked when she first heard me, saying I sounded different. I almost hung up right then, but I forced myself to stay on the line. She broke down immediately, and while I felt something, it wasn't what I expected. The pain of everything that had happened weighed more heavily than her words. She'd apparently been trying to text me throughout the year, but with her number blocked, they never reached me. I told her I was willing to work on rebuilding some kind of relationship, but it would take time. She then told me she was already packing her essentials before my stepfather returned home. She planned to file for divorce immediately. That's one thing about my mom. When she makes a decision, she commits to it completely. When my ex-fiancée got on the phone, the conversation hit differently. I reminded her of all the times I'd promised I'd never hurt her, how much I'd loved her. She was devastated, and when she mentioned still having my mom's ring, it upset me. I told her to give it back to my mom. It didn't belong to either of us anymore. I could tell that crushed her, and honestly, part of me wanted to take it back. We agreed to stay in touch, but I made it clear that any chance of rekindling our relationship was slim. My stepfather tried calling from different numbers after he got home and found my mom gone. I hung up immediately when I heard his voice and blocked each new number. Everyone stayed safe. Mom in a hotel he didn't know about, my ex-fiancé and stepbrother at their own places. Even his mother, a sweet lady who had always been kind to me, called to apologize for what her son had done. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I called him back. His voice made my skin crawl. When I asked why he'd done it, he said I wasn't man enough, and that a woman like her would have been wasted on me. The irony was, he knew nothing about our relationship. My ex-fiancée had always rejected traditional gender roles, had her own successful career, and never wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. When I flew back home for my uncle's 60th birthday, I finally met with Mom and my ex-fiancée at my stepbrother's place. There were lots of tears and apologies, and I struggled to keep it together. Mom had already filed for divorce, which I appreciated. My ex-fiancée had been seeing a therapist and invited me to join her for a session. She was putting in real effort to mend what had been broken. We went on a date that weekend, dinner and the arcade, like we used to do. It was my first date in almost a year and a half, and I enjoyed myself. But we both knew things couldn't just go back to how they were. She visited me in California a few times, but we eventually decided not to get back together. At least for now. These days, I've moved back to the East Coast, though I still keep a few states between me and my old hometown. My stepbrother and I talk regularly, and Mom and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. My ex-stepfather has disappeared from our lives, which is exactly how I want it. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever run into him again, but mostly I'm focused on moving forward. Looking back, it's strange how one person's actions can tear apart so many lives. But watching everyone work to put the pieces back together, my stepbrother's determination to uncover the truth, Mom's courage to start over, my ex-fiancé's commitment to healing, has taught me something about forgiveness and growth. We're all different people now, marked by what happened, but not defined by it, and maybe that's okay.